So welcome back to Igni Ferroque, the mod for Medieval 2 Total War, which I've only just started covering, and this is going to be my sort of road of continuing to try and mostly fail to get good at the mod, because obviously I'm still not entirely familiar with how everything works. But today we're going to have a 1v1 on a rather interesting sort of map, and I'm over here playing as the Kingdom of Denmark, and my opponent is going to be Rules 1, who is going to be playing as the Kingdom of France. Now, as you can see from this map, there are two ways around these two lakes through the trees over there, but the main action is going to be happening on and around this central hill here. So obviously there have been maps like this in many Total War games where the objective essentially is to try and take the hill and then move down, although you can get a little bit more creative with it, but nonetheless, we'll go through my army first of all, because obviously I know why I picked the units that I picked, and I can go through those reasons. And also, we can actually have it on high settings in this battle, because it's only a 1v1, and of course I don't think Igni Ferroque has got the same crashing problems that I suffer with Reforged. But at the front here, I've got 3 units of the Spear Militia. Now, having some form of disposable spears, or spears of some kind, is quite important, I've noticed in Igni Ferroque, because if you leave your front completely undefended from cavalry, cavalry can just charge right into the front of you, because it does have the survivability to withstand ranged fire on the approach. It still might take quite a few losses from something which is genuinely very powerful at range with armor-piercing projectiles like Pavis crossbows or some of the really high-tier gunpowder units, but for the most part, if you don't have a front line like this, the cavalry is going to be able to ravage you. Now, in this situation, Denmark have got some pretty nice higher-tier anti-cavalry tools, but for a front line, something disposable would work, and Spear Militia was really the best thing here because they are quite cheap and it allows me to spend more money in other places. For my archers, I do have 3 units of the Norse archers. Now, for the most part, this is an archer which will not be able to defeat some of the longbow units that Scotland, France and England of course can field, or they won't obviously be able to be a match for some of the eastern factions with some of their more heavily archer focused units. But against the likes of peasant archers, and I have already noticed that in Igni Ferroque it is very tempting to save money on your archers so that you can spend it elsewhere, Norse archers will very easily be able to overpower peasant archers over a prolonged period of fighting. Obviously they've got those little bucklers and they're better at range than peasant archers, and I've got 3 units of them, so pretty decent skirmish force all things considered. And then on either side I believe I have 4 units of the Norse swordsmen. Overall they're not particularly high up in terms of stats. They are very cheap, however, and this will give me more numbers on the front line, and obviously a little bit more of an infantry focus is where I was going with this, because as Denmark, I was naturally assuming that Denmark's infantry is going to be where they can leverage a bit of an advantage over France. France, of course, very well known historically for their cavalry, so I was a little bit concerned about that. 4 units of Norse swordsmen, 2 on each flank, so hopefully going to be able to push in from the side and do some nice damage there. And then more genuine damage dealers, I have 2 units of the dismounted Huscarls, which look very similar, all things considered, but they wield an axe in melee, and they are significantly better. They have a much higher attack stat, which means they'll be able to deal a lot more damage in melee, and overall this is going to be one of my 3 offensive units on the field today. And I think this is the other one, yes it is, the Einherjar Axemen, which they are a throwing axe unit, so they can throw their axes, and then they are pretty decent in melee as well. I believe they're multiple HP also. So hopefully here I've got these 3 units of axe-wielding infantry which will be able to support my more disposable infantry at the front in the Spear Militia and the Norse Swordsmen, and will be able to overwhelm with numbers and with damage. And then my other unit of range that I brought was a unit of Musketeers, because they are very high, well, they've got a lot of range, and hopefully I'd be able to focus down units from afar to ward them off, focus down some elite units for example. Then at the back, my last line in for my infantry force is going to be 2 units of dismounted Chivalric Knights, which there is a unit of Denmark infantry which is actually tougher than the Chivalric Knights, which is the Norse War Clerics, but they are very expensive because they are 3 HP and also they wield maces, so they're armor piercing. Didn't have enough money to bring those, so I decided to bring the Chivalric Knights instead, which should still do a very good job, because as the last line in, they'll be very tough and solid, and all of the damage I'd be hoping would already be done, and that would just be sort of the final nail in the coffin for any infantry line that I was facing. And then my cavalry force is made up of 4 units, 1 unit of Huscarls on each side. Now this is essentially a melee cavalry unit, so they are going to be very good when they get into a sustained melee with other cavalry. They're going to be very important for me, because obviously France are going to have brought some very nasty cavalry of their own. It's a very big thing for them, so hopefully these Huscarls will be able to shut down as much cavalry as they possibly can. My general is going to be in a unit of General's Bodyguard, of course. This is the entry-level General's Bodyguard, so the early period one, so it's only 2 HP rather than 4 HP that the late period one has, but it only costs 1,000, whereas the late period General's Bodyguard runs you in excess of 2,200. So yeah, the General's Bodyguard is going to be riding with the Huskarls, and then over on the other side, the final unit that I have brought today is going to be this unit here. Obviously there's more Huskarls in front, but I have a unit of mounted chivalric knights, which are going to be... They're going to be the cavalry unit I'm going to be trying to use aggressively to try and get into the back lines of France and do some hammer and anvil on their infantry, because if I can make their infantry line fall apart as quickly as possible, the match should go nicely in my favour, but we shall see. Now we'll have a look at rules though, and plans tend to work out quite poorly against rules because he's so good. And he is playing as France, so he has also brought some spear militia. Again, disposable spears at the front is a thing that I think I've seen in every Igni Ferroque game I've been part of so far. We've also got some Flemish pikemen, which of course, pikes are not as omnipresent as they are in Reforged. Not every faction even has access to pikemen. They are still obviously quite effective if you can get them into sustained melee, but for a general rule, their stats, especially their defensive stats, are garbage. Archers will be able to tear through them really, really easily. And also if you get around them even slightly, you know, if you manage to get around their formation, they're going to be destroyed almost immediately. But the Flemish pikemen are going to be here on the front line, presumably to prevent any sort of downhill charge from any potential cavalry, or make it a bit more difficult for the infantry, so there's more spear militia on the other side. We also have the peasant archers. Rules is a big fan, even in Reforged, of layering the army, I've noticed. And in Igni Ferroque, that sort of approach is rewarded, I think. You know, having these more disposable units at the front, the peasant archers, it makes it much more difficult for your opponent to get cost efficiency off against you if you keep all of your really good stuff a little bit further back. He also has a mortar. Now, the mortar, I believe, was obviously on this map you can fire over the hill, and to his good credit, he told me what sort of map it was, so it wasn't as if this was him trying to catch me out. But the mortar, I think, is just an attempt to sort of get me to charge over the hill, but I was going to be aggressive anyway, so ultimately the mortar is just going to hasten what I was going to do anyway. It's just going to make me a little bit more panicked and hurried in how I do it. I think he's also got 2 units of dismounted chivalric knights as well, possibly 3. That is a lot of chivalry. Yeah, that's got to be 3 units of dismounted chivalric knights. So he's got more of the defensive infantry than I have got, which based on the layout of his army is rather understandable. He's also got some handgunners on this side, which are a little bit more rudimentary than the musketeers. They have less range, I believe, but obviously gunpowder units can still be brutally effective if they're utilised correctly. And he's got some arquebusiers on this side as well, which is kind of like a medieval shotgun. They are very low range, but they can deal very high damage to lightly armoured targets. Which for the vast majority of my infantry will be quite bad, because I have mostly gone for a quantity approach. He's got some French longbowmen back here, which of course in terms of an archer force are going to be able to deal out some very nasty damage to my archer line and to my cavalry, because I believe all the longbowmen are armour piercing. And then back here he has got a general's bodyguard on foot, which obviously the foot general's bodyguard, you can see the general over here, is actually significantly cheaper than the cavalry variant. It's only 500 and they are individually very strong in combat, so it'll be interesting to see how this works out. But he also has a cavalry force back here, 2 units of mounted sergeants, and I can tell you as well that in the trees on both sides he does have 2 units of lancers, which I believe are standard heavy cavalry. So without further ado, let us begin. And the first thing to note obviously is the mortar is going to have the first word in this fight as they begin firing. Mortar is going to be able to get over the hill, so again a very nice position for the mortar to be in. It's the ideal battlefield for the mortar to really get as much efficiency as it can. You can see here that Rules is also moving forward slightly, but I think I deployed a little bit further forward for the most part than he did, and I was also charging up. I was very eager to take the top of the hill so that I could try and get some nice downhill charges with some of my more aggressive infantry. Now I don't have actually any dedicated shock troops, which might have been a mistake, but the Huskarls and the Einherjar Axemen should still be able to do me proud in this situation. Now the Spear Militia are just going to get up here to be my disposable front line. There goes the mortar, and it is firing on somewhere. Oh, there it is. It's going into my Norse archers. Pretty clustered force here, which is obviously a good thing for him. And Einherjar Axemen moving forward as well. The Norse archers don't have the best angle at the moment, but we are still peppering them down on the approach. And obviously the Flemish pikemen are not going to enjoy being under sustained archer fire from anything. Handgunners also moving forward, so Rules' infantry is now sort of heading up to the top of the hill to try and crest the hill. Pushing up my Huskarls to the side here. It's worth saying that I didn't know there were lancers on the field at this point, which is why I was moving my cavalry more centrally rather than going around the flanks. Also going to send forward my Spear Militia here. I'm going to obviously turn the speed down to probably half speed when we get into it, because things are going to happen relatively quickly. Archers trading fire, and Harry our Axeman also moving forwards, trying to get them out of the rain. Well, trying to get them out of the direct firing line of the mortar as much as I can. Bit of a hurried advance, all things considered. You can see my Norse swordsmen are moving up on the flanks to push in, and obviously the Norse swordsmen, they're not a terrific infantry unit, but they will be able to defeat the spear militia without too much of a problem. But the mounted sergeants are going to get a nice charge there into the front of my Norse swordsmen, which is unfortunate. They don't actually get too much in the way of kills, but as soon as I react, the Huskarls are going to get into melee with them, and that is going to force the retreat of the mounted sergeants. In fact, as we get into it now, it's a good time to go down to half speed, because this is where things are going to start to happen at a greater speed. Spear militia just going to be charging into the front. In hindsight, this was kind of a pointless gesture, because I don't think Rules was going to charge forward with his pikes anyway. But even so, putting more pressure on the front line, I think, would have been a good move. The Flemish pikemen are pushing back. But I have taken the top point of the hill, so I will be fighting downhill with my infantry. And considering the amount that I've invested into my infantry, this is a very good thing for me. I should be able to continuously push back against Rules' infantry force. The spear militia defeat seems certain for them, which is obvious. You know, they're facing off against a lot of dedicated swordsmen. You can see that the Einherjar axemen are also throwing their axes into the Flemish pikeman, which in terms of the... Interestingly enough, the axes bounce as well. But yeah, the Flemish pikemen are going to be my primary target with the Einherjar, because it's the only real target that I can hit right now, and getting rid of the pikes is obviously going to be a good thing for me. The Huskarls are going to absolutely butcher the mounted sergeants in a sustained fight. The mounted sergeants are light cavalry, and the Huskarls are heavy cavalry, although I think they are certainly more of a melee cavalry unit in my opinion. And the mounted sergeants are really going to start to struggle here, which is good news for me, because it means the flank will be open for my own cavalry, and this of course means that the chivalric knights are going to have the opportunity to charge into these handgunners over here. And obviously this is going to be really bad for the handgunners. Chivalric knights are certainly a heavy... well, they're certainly more of a shock cavalry with those lancers. See a very nice charge there. The handgunners are going to run, but forcing them to get away from the front line, getting less of Rules' gunpowder, firing onto my main infantry line is going to be very important for me. The peasant archers are still firing. The Flemish pikemen defeat is a distinct possibility, because their lines have essentially been circumvented by the sheer amount of spear militia, and also the Einherjar, which have been firing at them all this time. There is also another cavalry engagement on the other side, which again is very much the same thing. Mounted sergeants going up against Huskarls. Although over on this side the Huskarls are under longbow fire, so the longbows are going to take their toll on the Huskarls. Meanwhile, we can see over here on the flanks we see lancers, and you only have to look at them to see that this is the French cavalry, which means business. You know, the lancers are going to be the real damage dealers here for Rules, and he also has another unit of lancers over here, although I think he saw that this flank was in real danger of falling apart. The chivalric knights coming over here. I was trying to get in and around to get some nice charges off as well. Let's have a look at what's going on in the infantry fight, however. You can see that I have also moved forward. My chivalric knights and my Huskarls are in here now, although the Huskarls blend in a little bit more with my Norse swordsmen. But the initial line here, look at all the arrows peppering the ground here. But you can see that the front line here, the front line fight, there are my Huskarls. So the chivalric knights and the Huskarls are ready to charge forward when needed. Well, and this is going to be bad. The French general taking some point-blank musket fire there, the chivalric knights, but it is from the arquebusiers, and they do poorly against armoured units, and the chivalric knights obviously have got some good armour. Charging into the general's bodyguard there, though, trying to do some damage to the general. But unfortunately, as they are multiple HP, they do stand firm for at least one charge. So I'm going to need to keep my chivalric knights moving. I don't want them caught by the lancers if I can help it. So I am going to actually get my Huskarls into the lancers. But unfortunately, the lancers, they are outnumbering my Huskarls at this point. The range fire has taken its toll on my units. We'll see how well that fight goes. Dismounted chivalric knights trying to get back into the mounted chivalric knights of Denmark, but the longbows are also firing, and the AP damage on the longbows is going to be really important here. Norse swordsmen getting around the flank. I think I was going to try and get into the handgunners with this single unit of Norse swordsmen. At this point, I really should have pushed through the lines, because there really isn't anything left in terms of the French infantry line that can stop me at this point. But obviously, you know, the spear militia, the Flemish pikemen have largely fallen apart, and this means the peasant archers are largely open. And also at this point, I am going to push my Norse archers right onto the top of the hill, so they have a much better shot. But it's on this flank as well that my infantry has really done a number. My spear militia is pushing forward. Just a whole bunch of dismounted Huskarls and angry Norse swordsmen coming forward. And the peasant archers aren't going to last too much longer either. These Huskarls, meanwhile, have been taking continuous fire. Mounted sergeants over here are nearly out the way. But this was a bit of a waste on my part, to be honest with you. The mounted sergeants weren't really worth going after with my Huskarls because they're not the most dangerous cavalry unit on the field. And all this time they have been taking continuous fire from the French longbowmen. Oh, excuse me. Meanwhile, the chivalric knights are still taking fire, and this is the real problem I have, is obviously a lot of my cavalry is taking fire from armor-piercing missiles, which I only have one unit which has armor-piercing missiles, and that is the musketeers, which are still a little bit further back. The Einherjar have almost certainly used up most of their ammunition at this point, and at this point, with the collapse of this line, I decided to push forward everything to try and smash the French infantry line to bits. So I'm going to be pushing forward my chivalric knights along with everything else which survived the initial engagements. Charging in here, meanwhile, I think I was going for the arquebusiers here, and honestly that's probably not the best target here. I probably should have been going for the French longbowmen. The arquebusiers are only really dangerous to my lightly armoured infantry at this point in time, but even so, it's still going to be a decent charge, and obviously the arquebusiers are not going to be able to stand up to a charge from the chivalric knights at all, but the chivalric knights are starting to take a decent amount of damage. The mortar is still firing away, although how damaging that it has actually been, I'm not sure. Meanwhile, over here, another bit of bad news for me is slowly but surely my cavalry is starting to fall by the wayside. The lancers are over here, and they are slowly but surely beating my Huskarls, which is not good for me, of course. So as soon as my cavalry disappears, my infantry advantage might not count for an awful lot. So that's going to be bad for me, but here you can see the line of dismounted chivalric knights is here. My own chivalric knights are going to be colliding with them, and the rest of my infantry is also charging down the hill. Bit disjointed, but then I was trying to micro my cavalry as well, because if I stopped my cavalry moving it would have been slaughtered. Einherjar axemen also moving forward. You can see the Norse archers also getting into a good position on top of the hill. I've got some dismounted Huskarls up here, which I actually had in reserve, which I think I charge forward in a minute along with these Norse swordsmen. This unit of lancers over here I was just sort of trying to keep tabs on with my musketeers and my general's bodyguard. Meanwhile, here we can see the frontline engagement. Dismounted chivalric knights from both sides fighting, although obviously my infantry at this point is outnumbering the French infantry, so if the frontline fight continues to go as it is, my Danish forces are going to have victory, and then obviously all of Rules' ranged units won't count for an awful lot. I'm also continuing to harass these ranged units with my units of chivalric knights, which is still alive. I've got my dismounted Huskarls in the fight over here as well. Obviously their more attack focus will help the lower tier Norse swordsmen and spear militia to do a bit more damage to the French chivalric knights as they continue to fight one another. Meanwhile, here you can see that the units of infantry are coming downhill now, and over on this flank I was looking a little bit barren in terms of units, so it's a good thing that these two units of Norse swordsmen and dismounted Huskarls are coming in to lend their hand. Unfortunately for me though, you can see over there in the background the Huskarls, there are only 8 of them remaining now, and I think some support from range fire was also, well, also the mounted sergeants came back and got a rear charge on them, so very bad for me. So this unit of lancers is now free. I also tried to get a rear charge here into the chivalric knights, but this does mean that they become shaken, and it honestly wasn't the best charge anyway. They didn't really get any kills. It wasn't a clean charge, and that is important in Igni Ferroque. If your charge is broken, it will do next to nothing, I've noticed. And this means that my chivalric knights are probably going to fall by the wayside at this point. You can see here on the front line, the lancers now have a free flank because my cavalry is starting to fall apart. So despite the fact that I have an infantry advantage, at this point, all Rules needs is for his chivalric knights to hold and allow them to act as the anvil for the hammer of the cavalry. You can see that I do have a unit of chivalric knights which circumvented the front line and got into the French longbows, but the lancers are on the way. Here you can see the Huskarls coming in. Defeat seems certain for them. Although the continued pressure on this front line of chivalric knights should eventually tell if there are no outside factors, but of course the main outside factor is going to be these units of lancers. My chivalric knights are eager still, and I still need to continue harassing the French backline here. The Norse archers have now sort of switched their target to try and kill the lancers. This unit of lancers did take a fair amount of damage, but the problem is going to be this one. Outmaneuvered my general's bodyguard, this completely healthy unit of lancers is now into my archers, though the archers aren't the main prize. The archers, of course, you know, they've been sort of harassing the French army all this time, but the main prize is going to be a rear charge onto my infantry line, because that's going to be absolutely devastating for these mounted French knights. And of course they are going to pull through. Cavalry can pull through quite easily in Igni Ferroque, I've noticed. Meanwhile, the Chivalric Knights continuing to hold. Victory is a distinct possibility over here, where they're facing nothing but dismounted Huscarls and Spear Militia. But here in the middle, where my own Chivalric Knights are, balance of forces evenly matched. Victory is still a certainty. I'm not entirely sure why these Chivalric Knights over here were better than mine. But I'm sure that eventually that would have flipped in my favour. But it doesn't matter too much. Here we can see that I was winning by, well, it was over 10%. But at this point, I did try and turn around to get a counter-charge onto the Lancers, because there wasn't really anything else I could do with basic units of Huscarls. But obviously this is going to be devastating for me. I do actually have a unit of Chivalric Knights which is pulling around the flank over here. These Norse swordsmen unfortunately are routing off, however.
They have lost half their men.
Here you can see the Lancers. So I'm going to start to suffer really badly at the hands of these Lancers. So all of the infantry advantage that I held initially, you can see these Norse swordsmen and these other Norse swordsmen essentially trying to push around the flank to this Chivalric Knight front line. Eventually, but the pressure probably would have told. But we'll never know now, because obviously these French Lancers are going to be all it takes to turn this battle on its head. And at this point we may as well go up to 1 speed, because at this point everything is happening here in the middle. This late period cavalry, this sort of unit of Lancers are going to be very expensive. My general's bodyguard trying to hunt them down. At this point I can do little else other than try and bring the Lancers down and then hope that my general's bodyguard is enough to carry the day. I do still have my, well, I'd say that my Chivalric Knights are now routing off, the mounted sergeants are pursuing them. You can see the other Chivalric Knights are now getting into the front line. And at this point the battle is swinging against me. So despite the fact that I was able to push the French army back down the hill and my infantry was doing a good job, in the end it was a bit of, it was poor play on my part, to be honest with you, that I allowed that unit of Lancers to get in behind me. But even if I was keeping tabs on it and not microing my own cavalry, I think was the thing that I was doing at the time, I don't think I would have been able to stop them, because cavalry can so easily pull through lines in this that I don't think I would have been able to stop them regardless without the use of my Huscarls, which of course had long since been expended. One of my units of Huscarls that we missed actually did get fully finished off by the longbows when I tried to get a rear charge earlier in the fight with my Huscarls. Now my Norse archers at this point are out of ammunition, and I could see my front line was falling apart, so I just decided to try and commit them. They're obviously not going to be great in melee, but at this point I don't have much of a choice. I do still have a relatively healthy unit of Chivalric Knights, interestingly enough. Nowhere near as healthy as the ones that Rules has available to him at this point in time, though. Yeah, and it's unfortunate to see your whole army routed, and again, how strong cavalry is, I'm not entirely, you know, this is personal preference, you know, the mod does seem, to my mind, that I've seen so far to be very well balanced, but personal preference, I don't like it when a single unit of cavalry can essentially turn the whole course of the battle on its head. You know, that's just my preference. I know that a lot of people like using cavalry, but for me, it's never been my favourite part of Total War, because you can pull off some really janky manoeuvres with it, which always struck me as a little cheesy. Not that Rules did that this time, but it was the initial thing which turned me off being sort of more cavalry-centric. But in this situation, obviously, the cavalry was all it took to essentially swing the course of the battle from, you know, my advantage. I was just over 10 percentage points ahead, very heavily into the favour of Rules. You can see now that it is swung almost entirely on its head very, very quickly as a result of just 2 units of cavalry. And it was mainly just 1 unit of Lancers, to be honest with you. The other one was pretty heftily damaged from the confrontation with my Huscarls, so you can see the Norse archers still firing, and at this point it's just going to be case of trying to clear up. I'm still trying to chase these Lancers, and obviously they're just going to continue to try and run away, slipping away. Spear Militia getting into them, but a charge is probably going to be enough to break the Spear Militia, question mark. And one of the things which allows them to pull through is in Igni Ferroque, a lot of this really heavy cavalry units can have 3 or even 4 hit points sometimes. Which means they can pull through lines with very limited casualties once or twice. Obviously, eventually that will still have a pretty major impact on them, but you know, you're allowed that sort of safety net of being able to do that a few times. I do still have some ranged units, I do still have my musketeers, but at this point my infantry line has fallen apart, and at this point it's Rules' infantry which is essentially going to guarantee his victory, because he still has a very healthy amount of dismounted Chivalric Knights, and it doesn't really matter how many Norse archers I throw at them, they're just going to be able to smash their way through them. I do still have some chivalric knights of my own, although only 47 of them, not nearly enough to put up a decent enough fight, and also Rules still has his French longbowmen, and some peasant archers, and some gunpowder, which of course are going to continue to ensure that his victory is almost certain. I do still have my general's bodyguard, which at this point is really the only heavy cavalry left. But with all of these armor-piercing missiles, there is only going to be a limited amount of damage I can do. And he does still have a couple of units of Flemish pikemen hidden in his infantry line, I'm fairly certain. There goes more of my Norse archers. Yeah, he still has a unit of Flemish pikemen over here. So even if I manage to charge literally everything else to death, all it's going to take is his French pikemen, Flemish pikemen rather, to have an effect. The handgun is getting some friendly fire there though. The Danish bodyguard. I'm just trying to rout off the peasant archers just so that it doesn't look like such a whitewash on my part, to be honest with you, just so more of the French units are routing from the field. And indeed I did manage to rout off more spear militia. There are these peasant archers over here as well. You can see over here my chivalric knights. It makes sense, I suppose, that the French knights are having the better of it against Danish knights. Oof. More gunpowder coming in, handgunners at point blank range. Not entirely sure what I was hoping to do there. The mounted sergeants are coming for me, but at this point I'm just sort of pulling away from them at every available opportunity. So this is essentially what was happening to me earlier on. I just could not catch the lancers, and now I'm doing the same thing, which again, this is the sort of thing which I'm not really a big fan of. The fact that you can just do this with cavalry, because the battle's already gone from my favour at this point. I'm not going to be able to win it at this point. But even so, I'm just able to completely avoid all of his defences with just one unit of cavalry, just because I can pull away from them so easily. Some people might not like the fact that sometimes in various variants of the Third Age mod, and to an extent in the standard version of Medieval, it feels like your cavalry's like getting stuck on everything, like they're covered in Velcro. But it was kind of important to the balance of things as well, because if you have your cavalry like this, it means you can just sort of run around and just go through most things unless it's an anti-cavalry unit. And at this point I'm just trying to get as many kills as I possibly can. Obviously the infantry fight has long since left my favour, although my chivalric knights are still fighting. Well, they're fighting to the death at this point. But still, good for them. The Flemish pikemen have pulled out their butter knives. And you can see here as well that these chivalric knights have pulled through into what remains of my ranged units. Not much of them, to be fair. A couple of units of Norse archers and my musketeers. Routing chivalric knights, I decided to charge in here, and at this point, obviously when they get caught in melee with the dismounted chivalric knights, that's going to be the end for them. There goes my general. And obviously this is insurmountable at this point, but still fairly close all things considered for a 1v1. There's not too much of Rules' army left. I mean, he does still have quite a few chivalric knights, to be fair, which are more elite infantry, so it is worth a good deal more. But even so, all of his cavalry was eventually destroyed, except for like one unit of mounted sergeants. Only 3 of them remaining. So at the very least, I did manage to destroy all of the French cavalry to a point, all of the important ones anyway. So what could I have done to prevent that? Now obviously if I managed to prevent the rear charge from the cavalry, things probably would have gone in my favour, because I did have that unit of chivalric knights going around the flank, which could have wrapped up the line, because everywhere else Rules had more chivalric knights than me, which is probably why his front line was, it said that it was either evenly matched or in certain places Rules was winning. But obviously eventually if my chivalric knights were allowed to sort of go up the line, that would have been, that should have sent the infantry fight into my favour, particularly with how many men I still had left on the front line. Also, I still have my Norse archers, which would have been able to provide overwatch had they not been trampled by the lancers. And the musketeers, of course, which could have been utilised against the chivalric knights as well. But really I needed to keep my Hussars back in reserve. I committed them early against the mounted sergeants, and this allowed the French longbowmen to essentially shoot them to death. The other things, I needed the Hussars essentially. I needed to use them a little bit more wisely. Of course I managed to destroy the mounted sergeants, but the mounted sergeants were really not the main threat. I could have essentially tried to shoot them to death and kept my Hussars in reserve for the lancers, but then I didn't know that the lancers were in the trees initially, so obviously nice ambush there. So let's have a look at the kills on all my units. Obviously General's Bodyguard getting 112. That's obviously some nice shot cavalry stats there. Einherjar axemen getting 112 as well, so some good kills on the pikemen in particular. I think they also ended up throwing their axes into peasant archers when the Flemish pikemen either routed or retreated, which is a bit of a waste, but most of that was pikes, I believe. Obviously the chivalric knights getting the most kills for me. They were the unit which was running around in behind the French lines doing a lot of damage. If I had another unit of shock cavalry back there as well, that might have been something else which would have helped. The Huskars, that was entirely cavalry kills basically, so good kills considering. Dismounted Huskars not doing quite so well, but then by the time they got into the fight it was mostly against dismounted chivalric knights, so to be fair to them, that's not too bad for them. And then the Norse swordsmen and the spear militia, they all got decent amount of kills, but again they were up against other spear militia and they managed to get in and around pike defences, so not entirely certain how much you can read into that. The musketeers not doing all that well, considering that I was hoping they would manage to hunt down some of the elite units a little bit better. Chivalric knights, one of them did okay, the other one was overwhelmed and rear charged by cavalry. So yeah, I mean again, it is more personal preference that I don't really like how, you know, cavalry centric that this mod seems to be. I do still enjoy playing it, you know, but ultimately I've kind of accepted the fact that I'm probably never going to be a master at this game, purely because I've never been very good at microing cavalry, and that's just how it is. And essentially, I think 8 times out of 10, whoever has the better cavalry micro in a 1v1 in Igni Ferroque, they're going to win, because the cavalry is so strong, it's able to deal such heavy damage, it was able to swing this fight so heftily against me, that, yeah. It's also very expensive, to be fair, so it's not like it's imbalanced. A unit of really nice cavalry like that costs around 2,000 florins, which obviously means you're going to have to cut corners elsewhere. But Rules had to. He had a lot of lower tier units which he had to use to try and hold back my infantry, which for the most part were just swept aside by the infantry assault of Denmark. But yeah, I mean, in terms of other units I could have brought, Denmark do have some high tier halberds, which would have been potentially a very good choice. Also, something else I could have done, instead of using the general's bodyguard, I could have instead put my general in a unit of mounted Norse war clerics, which essentially are even stronger in melee than the mounted Huskars are, which would have been interesting. It's not a dedicated general's bodyguard unit, so they're not unbreakable. But even so, if I had had them in the back sort of lines instead of my general's bodyguard there, if they had caught up with the Lancers, it would have been very, very bad for them, because not only are they anti-cavalry, but they're also AP with maces. So that would have been something good as well. So yeah, I mean, obviously a loss, not a terrible loss though. It was, you know, I'd like to think I held my own pretty decently in that battle there, all things considered. So yeah, hopefully more Igni Ferroque will follow at some point soon. Obviously Reforge will also be forthcoming. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, found it somewhat informative, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.